Page 85, Chapter 7. In this company there rode two men named Jackson, one black, one white, both forenamed John. Bad blood lay between them, and as they rode up under the barren mountains, the white man would fall back alongside the other and take his shadow for the shade that was in it and whisper to him. The black would check or start his horse to shake him off, as if the white man were in violation of his person, had stumbled onto some ritual dormant in his dark blood or his dark soul, whereby the shape he stood, the sun from on that rocky ground, bore something of the man himself, and in so doing lay imperiled. The white man laughed and crooned things to him that sounded like the words of love. All watched to see how this would go with them, but none would caution either back from his course, and when Glanton looked to the rear along the column from time to time, he seemed to simply reckon them among his number and ride on. Early that morning, the company had met in a courtyard behind a house on the outskirts of the city. The two men carried from a wagon a stenciled ordnance box from the Baton Rouge arsenal, and a Prussian Jew named Speyer pried open the box with a pritchel and a shoeing hammer and handed it up a flat package of brown butcher paper, translucent with grease like a paper of bakery goods. Glanton opened the package and let the paper fall to the dirt. It was a huge sidearm meant for dragoons. It carried in its long cylinders a rifle's charge and a weigh close to 5 pounds loaded. These pistols would drive the half-ounce conical ball through 6 inches of hardwood, and there were 4 dozen of them in the case. Speyer was breaking out the gang molds and flasks and tools, and Judge Holden was unwrapping another of the pistols. The men pressed about. Glanton wiped the bore and chambers of the piece and took the flask from Speyer. "He's a stout looker," said one. He charged the bores and seated a bullet and drove it home with the hinged lever pinned to the underside of the barrel. When all the chambers were loaded, he capped them and looked about. In that courtyard, other than the merchants and buyers, were a number of living things. The first that Glanton drew sight upon was a cat. At that precise moment appeared upon the high wall with the other side as silently as a bird alighting. It turned to pick its way along the cusp of broken glass set upright on the mud masonry. Glanton leveled the huge pistol in one hand and thumbed back the hammer. The explosion in that dead silence was enormous. The cat simply disappeared. There was no blood or cry, it just vanished. Speyer glanced uneasily at the Mexicans. They were watching Glanton. Glanton thumbed back the hammer again and swung the pistol. A group of fowl in the corner of the courtyard that had been pecking in the dry dust stood nervously, their heads at various angles. The pistol roared, and one of the birds exploded in a cloud of feathers. The others began to trot mutely, their long necks craned. He fired again. A second bird spun and lay licking. The others flared, piping thinly. Glanton turned the pistol and shot a small goat that was standing with its throat pressed to the wall in terror, and it fell stone dead in the dust as he fired upon a clay garaffa that burst in a shower of potsherds and water, and he raised the pistols and swung toward the house and rang the bell in its mud tower above the roof. a solemn tolling that hung on in the emptiness after the echoes of the gunfire had died away. A haze of gray gun smoke lay over the courtyard. Glanton set the hammock at half-cock and spun the cylinder and lowered the hammer again. A woman appeared in the doorway of the house, and one of the Mexicans spoke to her, and she went in again. Glanton looked at Holden, and then he looked at Spear. The Jew smiled nervously. They ain't worth no $50. Spear looked grave. What is your life worth? He said. In Texas, 500. You'd have to discount the note with your ass. Mr. Riddle thinks it's a fair price. Mr. Riddle ain't paying for it. He's putting up the money. Glanton turned the pistol in his hand and examined it. I thought it was agreed, said Spear. Ain't nothing agreed. They're contracted for the war. You'll not see their like again. Not till some money changes hands, it ain't agreed. A detachment of soldiers, 10 or dozen of them, entered from the street with their arms at the ready. ¿Qué pasa aquí? Glanton looked at the Mexican soldiers with that interest. Nada, said Spear. Todo va bien. Bien? The sergeant was looking at the dead birds, the goat. The woman appeared at the door again. Está bien, said Holden. Negocios con gobernador. The sergeant looked at them, and he looked at the woman on the door. Somos amigos del señor Riddle, said Spear. Ándale, said Glanton. You and your half-assed looking niggers. The sergeant stepped forward and assumed a picture of authority. Glanton spat. The judge had already crossed the space between them. Now he took the sergeant aside and fell to conversing with him. The sergeant came to his armpit. The judge spoke warmly and gestured with a great expansiveness of spirit. The soldiers squatted in the dust with their muskets and regarded the judge without expression. Don't you give that son of a bitch no money, said Glanton. But the judge was already bringing the man forward a formal presentation. Le presentó al Sargento Aguilar, he called, hugging the ragged militant to him. The sergeant held out his hand quite gravely. He occupied the space and attention of all who stood there like something presented for validation, and then Spear stepped forward and took it. Mucho gusto. Igualmente, said the sergeant. The judge escorted him from one to the next of the company, the sergeant formal and the Americans muttering obscenities or shaking their heads silently. The soldiers squatted on their heels and watched each movement in this charade with the same dull interest, and at length the judge hove up before the black. The dark, vexed face. He studied it, and he drew the sergeant forward, the better for him to observe, and then him began a laborious introduction in Spanish. He sketched for the sergeant a problematic career of the man before him, his hands drafting with a marvelous dexterity the shapes of what varied paths conspired here in the ultimate authority of the extent, as he told them, like strings drawn together through the eye of a ring. He adduced for their consideration references to the children of Ham, the lost tribe of Israelites, certain passages from the Greek poets, anthropological speculations as to the propagation of the races and their dispersion and isolation through the agency of geometric cataclysm, and assessment in racial trends with respect to climate and geographical influences. The sergeant listened to this and more with great attention, and when the judge was done, he stepped forward and held out his hand. Jackson ignored him. He looked at the judge. "What did you tell him, Holden?" "Don't insult him, man. What did you tell him?" The sergeant's face had clouded. The judge took him about the shoulders and leaned and spoke into his ear, and the sergeant nodded and stepped back and saluted the black. "What did you tell him, Holden?" "That shaking of hands was not the customary of your land." "Before that, what did they say to him before that?" The judge smiled. "It is not necessary," he said, "that the principals here be in possession of the facts concerning their case, for their acts will ultimately accommodate history with or without their understanding. But it's consistent with notions of right principle that these facts, to the extent that they can be readily made to do so, should find a repository in the witness of some third party. Sergeant Aguilar is just such a party, and a such party to his office is but a secondary consideration when compared to divergences in that larger protocol exacted by the formal agenda of an absolute destiny. Words are things. The words he is in possession of cannot be deprived of. Their authority transcends his ignorance of that morning." The black was sweating. A dark man in his temple pulsed like a fuse. The company had listened to the judge in silence. A few smiled. The Hugh Halfwin killers from Missouri guffawed softly like an asthmatic. The judge turned again to the sergeant and turned again in the courtyard, and the judge showed him one of the pistols and explained it's working with great parents. The sergeant's men had risen and stood waiting. At the gate, the judge doled coins into Aguilar's palm, and he shook hands formally with each ragged charge and acclimatized them upon their military bearing, and they exited into the street. At noon that day, the partisans rolled out, each man armed with a pair of pistols, and took the road up country as told. The outriders returned in the evening, and the men dismounted for the first time that day and recruited their horses in the sparse swale, while Glinton conferred with the scouts. Well, they rode on until dark and made camp. Toadvine and the veteran and the kid squatted at a small remove from the fires. They did not know that they were set forth in that company in the place of 3 men slain in the desert. They watched the Delawares, of which there were a number in the party, and they sat somewhat apart, crouched in their heels, one pounding coffee beans on the buckskin while another stirred at the fire, working on some sort of his hand amongst the absolute members or cucumbers, coal with to light his pipe. They're about in the morning before daybreak, and they caught up and saddled their mounts as soon as the light enough could see. The jagged mountains were pure blue in the dawn, and everywhere birds twittered, and the sun, when it rose, caught the moon in the west, so it could be lays opposed to each other in the sky and in the earth. The sun white hot, and the moon very hot. And whose terminals burn worlds past reckoning. As the riders came up and hit with a light clink of arms and shake of bitterings, the sun climbed, the moon set, and the horses and the dew-soaked mules commenced to steam in fuel and in shadow.